It says good battery. Okay. Maybe I didn't hit the button. So, yeah. Go ahead. Question.
This is one of those things where, I mean, even today, when we have elections, we think we're choosing, but we read other places, God says He appoints the leaders, right?
Absolutely.
So it's almost like, I don't want to say it's preordained, but in a way, God's going to choose, and it could be a good person or it could be a bad person.
It could be.
Right? And
right.
So it seems like when the people didn't pick Saul.
Correct.
Right? He picked Saul,
Mm-hmm.
but he had a reason for doing it.
Yes.
So, I mean, so it's kind of...
But, I'm sorry, dear. But the 13 says, here's the king used, the people have chosen. So like you said, he's the king that these people would have chosen anyway if they were given the first voice to choose.
Correct.
Go back to chapter 9. God tells Samuel, this is the guy you're going to pick, right?
Right. Before you ever put him before the people.
Right.
Yeah, so
And then they chose the king by lot. Remember, they reduced the tribes down until it ended up with Kish. And they're like, okay, where's your son? Right? Oh, he's hiding behind the luggage. And so that process of choosing the king by lot, by random lot, is really saying God chose him, right? They're looking for the one God chose. But God is saying, no, that's the one you wanted, though.
I mean, in a way, it's very parallel to today. You can choose a bad leader.
Yep.
And I'm going to let you choose that bad leader. And
Correct.
you pay the consequences for having that leader.
Yep. I think many of us feel that way today. But yeah.
God already knew that leader, be it good or bad,
But it does. I mean,
already chosen by God.
even when you get one you like, sometimes things don't work out, right? It's just, that's the way it goes. God teaches lessons in all those things. Part of it is that it says, right, like in Romans 13:1, every government has been established by God. Every government in the world, right? It may be for a form of judgment or a lesson. It may be a turn around and have a time of revival or a time of refreshment. But God chooses the leaders. God chooses all the leaders of the world.
Is it correct to say that God chooses first and then the people choose?
Yeah.
That would be correct to say.
Yeah. Reverse it this way. Can a man choose whatever he wants and go against God's foreordained direction?
Yeah.
He can. So I can choose to rebel, and God says, oh, I didn't see that coming. I didn't know you were going to do that.
No.
See, it's a tension that you have to resolve about God's sovereignty, right? We can choose anything we want, but God's sovereignty rules on top of that, right? God can take what people mean for evil and turn it into good. God can take what people mean for good and give them a lesson, right? And no matter what, He's going to give you a lesson. God's a pretty good teacher and instructor in things. And so sometimes you think you're going this direction, and you realize, well, God taught me a lesson out of that one, right? God can do that, and He does it with the rulers of the world. God, in Isaiah, it says God holds the rulers of the world like He can move them around like water in His hand. Just that easy. Just a little tilt. Boop. I do what I want with them. Right? And at the same time, He says in Psalm 2, all the rulers of the world are held responsible to follow Jesus Christ. Why do the nations rage? Why are they so upset? Because God has established a ruler over them, and they don't want to follow. So they're held responsible even if they don't even know He chose them. Right? So you have all that tension about the sovereignty of God moving through the affairs of mankind. And what Israel does in the history of Israel is say, it's still like that today. God hasn't stopped ruling over the universe, and He hasn't stopped ruling over the nations of the world. We're a little different than Israel in that they were a unique nation, but God's sovereignty isn't any different, and it helps us to understand that. Right? It's why we should exercise whatever rights God has given us and vote for rulers and vote for laws and try to have good laws and try to get rid of bad laws. But ultimately, God knows, and God directs those things, and the outcome is in His hands. So yeah, when you get into a discussion like that, and it's a great question, that who is Saul and what does he represent? Well, God chose him. He chose him because the people asked for a king, and because they asked for a king with a bad heart, he gives them a king with a bad heart. And he gives them a king like them to show them this is really a problem that you asked for a king. Right? Now, he gives them the bad one first so that he can set up and say, now here's the one I really wanted. David. Right? Now that you've had a taste of a bad king, now you'll understand a little bit more when you get the good king. Okay? And David's not a perfect guy. David's filled with mistakes too. But it's one of the points of comparison that you got to make is that why is Saul a bad king and David a good king if they're both making mistakes and they're both sinning and it's how they respond to God in the midst of those choices, right? Saul never really repents. He never has a heart that turns to God, and he very rarely, if ever, asks God for any direction. Where David is constantly in prayer and seeking the Lord, and when he makes a mistake, he's quick to turn around and admit that and get right again. And that's the attitude of a believer, right? We all make mistakes, and the problem is that, you get people into trouble in their family, trouble in their marriage, trouble whatever. They leave the church. Why? Because they don't want to admit their mistakes and get right with God. A lot of times they're just hiding it. And rather than getting right with God and staying with it and letting, there's nobody perfect in the church, right? We're all sinners who are getting right with God and walking with the Lord. It's how we handle the issues of life that really give that, do we have a heart like David or a heart like Saul? And that's the comparison that the Bible makes. So that's one of the reasons why he chooses Saul first. You get the bad lesson first. It helps to understand the good lesson, right? We understand about being a sinner, and it helps us to understand living under mercy and grace. And I think there's a parallel to that as well. So chapter 12 is a pivotal point, right? It's the end of the transition of Saul, and it gets us into that point where you kind of look and you see that in you have this chapter 12 transition, and then in verse he's talking about now Saul going out, and he's going to travel and go after the Amalekites, right? So you have this little prophetic in chapter 12 and verse 17, prophetic confirmation of Saul by asking for it to rain, and Samuel's able to make it rain, and so this is establishing for itself, right? That, as it says in chapter 12 and verse 19, it was there that he says, "Then all the people said to Samuel, 'Pray for your servants to Yahweh your God, so that we may not die. For we have added to all of our sins this evil by asking for ourselves a king.'" Right? There's the confirmation that they realize, now we see, right, we have this bad choice we're going to live with because it wasn't good for us to ask for a king.
So there are no do-overs?
Nope. God says you're going to learn a lesson. Sometimes you got to follow it through. Yeah. And so that's what it says, And Samuel said to the people, "Do not fear." In verse 20, "You have committed all this evil, and yet still do not turn aside from following Yahweh, but serve him with all your heart. You must not turn aside, for then you would go after meaningless things which cannot profit." You're going to look for answers. I'll find an answer somewhere else, right? I made this mistake, but I can fix it by myself. You're still on that doing it by myself mode. Christians are not meant to be doing things by themselves, right? Under pressure, under stress and anxiety, we think, well, I made one mistake, I can fix it with a second one, right? I'll just keep going until I can fix this by myself. When you should be looking for God.
When Saul became king, was he young? Because if he was young,
he was a younger guy.
In there a long time.
He was in there 40 years.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of suffering then.
It wasn't just a 4-year and then I can vote him out.
No. 40
Yeah.
years, so
And it should have been sooner. Part of it is he hangs on to the kingdom a lot longer than he should have, as we'll see as we get a look going here. We're spending a lot of time on the transition, but that's good because it's really good for us to understand it. So he's going to come up very quickly and realize that he makes enough mistakes that God says, I'm going to take the kingdom from you. But guess what? He hangs on for, 35 more years or whatever, right? So he does do that. But here in chapter 12, the transition is that God's going to teach them a lesson about the person they picked, which was the question we started with. And they have to admit that we chose poorly. And here Samuel is giving them the advice, stick with God. Don't try to fix this yourselves, right? And again, I think there's a lesson in that we need to realize that once we've realized our mistake, we need to look for God's solution, right? Often it's a more difficult solution or a more shameful or embarrassing solution, but sometimes we got to get through that to get right? Admit our mistakes, even admit them openly and say, I got to go in a different direction, right? But be pleasing to God overall. So this is what chapter 12 is about. And so he says that, right, you have asked for this evil, but don't turn aside. And so then you get into chapter 13. Let's get there. I'm going to just get to chapter 13 to move on. And so now Saul has to go in, and it says this is the next transition, the reign of Saul from chapters 13 through 15, verse 9. This is what it was like when Saul reigned. It says he was 30 years old, so he was a young guy, right? When he began to reign, and he reigned 42 years over Israel. There's the length of how long he ruled. And Saul chose for himself 3,000 men of Israel, of which 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah. So they're just talking about now going into this battle with the Amalekites, which is historically, if you remember, in the Judges, the Amalekites had a problem with Israel coming in, and it's the modern day language. You're going to hear this language in politics today, right? They were colonialists and settlers, and they came into our land and they took it from us, right? That's how they talk about it today. The Amalekites were saying that back in the book of Judges, right? You came in and took our land, and we want it back, right? That's the Amalekites. That's who they were. And so they had a problem. God raised up judges to put them, and help them with the Amalekites. And now Saul is going back after that, and he's going to battle with the Amalekites. They're still at it. So they haven't changed their opinion. And God says, you're going to go in and you're going to deal with the Amalekites, right? And so they split their army, 2,000 with Saul and 1,000 with Jonathan, and they're going to go in different directions, and they're going to kind of try to have a strategy of fighting with the Amalekites. And in verse 3 it says, Jonathan struck the garrison of the Philistines that was in Geba, and the Philistines heard about it. Then Saul blew the trumpet throughout the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear, right? So Jonathan takes his little sneak force in of 1,000 men, and he strikes the first blow. It riles up the Philistines, and now they're getting involved in it. And the Philistines, well, maybe this is the Philistines. Sorry, this is the Philistine battle. I'm using the wrong one. The Amalekites were the battle before this. So apologies there. Got the wrong group. But Philistines anyway, they're also people who are not original to the land.
Dave,
yeah.
This is Jonathan, his son?
Yes, it is.
So I'm trying to do the math here. He either had a kid really young, or Jonathan's not very old.
Yep. He's a young guy.
He can't be much more than 15 or...
He's probably just adult age. Just old enough to go into battle, which would have been 15 or older. Yeah.
So he can't really be super experienced either.
Not a bit. Not a bit. He's a young guy. And so, he takes and he strikes the Philistines, and Israel heard the news that Saul had struck the garrison of the Philistines, and also that Israel had become odious to the Philistines, and the people summoned Saul to Gilgal. Now, we're talking 2,000 men and 1,000 men, so the Philistines decide we need to get our army together. And look at the numbers in verse 5, 30,000 and 6,000, right? 30,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen. And so they're taking their top-notch army, and gathering it together, and they're going to camp to fight against Israel. The men, now, verse 6. Now the men of Israel saw that they were in a strait. They were in a difficult position, for the people were hard pressed. Then the people hid themselves in the caves and the thickets and the cliffs and the cellars. They're like, uh-oh, we've stirred up a hornet's nest. It's time to go and hide. Right? Some of the Hebrews crossed the Jordan into the land of Gad and Gilead, but for Saul, he was still in Gilgal, and all the people following him were trembling, in verse 7. So you have this picture of, we're going to poke at the Philistines, and then the Philistines said, well, we're not just going to go to battle, we're going to finish this whole thing. They assemble 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen for this fight. Now, he's supposed to wait, as it says in verse 8. Here's one of Saul's first problems. So he waited in verse 8 7 days, according to the appointed time set by Samuel. So in this battle, Philistines are gathering their 30,000 and 6,000 against their 2,000 and 1,000. Samuel told Saul, it's okay, be patient and wait. We're going to watch God at work here. And you need to wait 7 days, right? And the people were scattering from him, right? Because Samuel did not come to Gilgal. So Saul jumps the gun in verse 9. It says, bring near to me the burnt offering and the peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering, right? So here is a king where, according to the law, would not perform the priestly functions, right? He's not a judge. He's not like Samuel, who can operate in different modes when God calls him to. You're in the office of a king, and you've already been told to wait. And he didn't wait, and so he offers the sacrifice when he's not supposed to offer the sacrifice. Verse 10 says, as soon as he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. Imagine that, right? It's like he's probably just got the fire going and, killed this animal, and in walks Samuel with his hand in the cookie jar, right? Came out to meet him and greet him, and Samuel said in verse 11, what have you done? Right? And that's in verse 11. His answer, not satisfactory. He says, because I saw that the people were scattering from me, and that you did not come within the appointed days, and that the Philistines were assembling, therefore I said, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I have not entreated the favor of Yahweh. So I forced myself and offered the burnt offering, right? I don't want to go into this thing without God's blessing, and so, boy, I thought I ran out of time, and I just thought there was no time. I made that snap decision to just offer it myself. I forced myself and offered the burnt offering. But Samuel answers and says, you have acted foolishly, right? He allowed the pressure to dictate his decision. He allowed the pressure of the Philistines, the pressure of his people leaving, and the pressure of Samuel showing up, even possibly a little bit late. At least, he didn't wait. Maybe he figured if he's not here by 7 in the morning, I'm going, right? And so, but all three of those pressures, all three of those external forces, he says, boy, I just had all this pressure and anxiety on me, and I just had to pull the trigger and do this thing, make a solution for myself. And that's where it's really not showing a trust in God. He says, right, oh, look, I didn't want to go in there without entreating the favor of Yahweh. But at the same time, right, did you even ask Yahweh? Did you pray? Could have asked that question. Did you pray about it first? Did you ask God what you should do? Or did you just say, well, I got a solution for myself. This will alleviate all my pressure, and that's what I'm looking for. And I think that's what happens here, is that in verse 13, you've acted foolishly, you have not kept the commandment of Yahweh your God, which he commanded you. And now Yahweh would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, right? So the establishing of a king in Israel was meant to be a dynasty. It was meant to be a lineage of the people of Israel from the family of the king. And here it is that obedience to God, the potential was for Saul, it could have established his lineage forever, right? But he didn't obey. And so That's the choice. And it says, now in verse 14, your kingdom shall not endure. And here's what, in God's sovereignty, knowing all of this, Yahweh has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. And that's our memory verse for the whole book, right, is to say that this is God's wisdom. God's saying, you've learned your bad lesson, right, and yeah, you're going to endure it for another, 42 years. And yet, he says, I've chosen somebody, a man after my own heart, and Yahweh has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not kept what Yahweh commanded you. In his response, Samuel arose, went up from Gilgal to Gibeah of Benjamin. Saul numbered the people who were with him. About 600 men are left. Right? We had 2,000 men, only 600 have remained. And that's the situation that he's in. And it says in verse 16, Saul and his son Jonathan and the people who were present with them were staying at Gibeah of Benjamin, and the Philistines camped at Michmash. And the raiders came up from the camp of the Philistines in 3 companies. And one company turned toward Ophrah and the land of Shual, and the other company turned to the way of Beth Horon, and another company turned the way of the border which overlooks the valley of Zeboim toward the wilderness. Now, so what is happening is they're just going to surround Saul, right? The idea is we're just going to overwhelm and surround him. One goes down the middle, kind of one on either side, right? Split the company into 3 parts. Now, another problem is that it reads in verse 19, no blacksmith could be found in all the land of Israel. Why? Because the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make swords or spears. So all of Israel went down to the Philistine, each to sharpen his plowshare, his mattock, his axe, or his goad. And the charge was 2/3 of a shekel for the plowshares and the axes to fix and all them. So it happened on the day of battle that neither sword nor spear, in verse 22, was found in the hands of any of the people who were with Saul and Jonathan, but they were found with. But they did the 2 people who had good weapons, Saul and Jonathan. They're taking farmers out to fight with farm weapons, right? You're going to take plows and farming implements and pitchforks and whatnot, and they're going to go out, axes, and they're going to go out and fight against the Philistines, 600 men. So the problem is that, the whole situation was that God said, wait for me and I'll deliver you. The people were scattering, the Philistines were growing, and Samuel was late. He gave into the pressure and made a foolish decision, and so now he's stuck with this 600 men with farming equipment to go fight a battle-hardened army. That's the situation that he's in. And he doesn't have a whole lot of confidence in God because, God's keeping the pressure on him, and so he's still struggling with his anxiety over this whole battle. The pressure has not been let off of him. So in verse 14, or chapter 14, then, you get into the battle with, I'm getting caught up here. Verse 14:1, chapter 14, verse 1, the day came when that Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to the young man who was carrying his armor, come, let us cross over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side. But he did not tell his father. So you want to ask if he was a young guy? He is, because he's going off and doing stuff without telling his dad. It happens all the time, right? So, yeah, he's young enough to do something like that. Honestly, and I do believe that shows his youthfulness, right? So he's in there, rash and youthful, but not in a bad way. So Saul, as it says, was staying in the outskirts of Gibeah under the pomegranate tree, which is at Migron, and I don't know the geography of that, but people who were with him were about 600 men, which we've already established, right? And the people, it says in the end of verse 3, did not know that Jonathan had gone. So verse 6, it says, here's what happened. Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor as they've gone off on the other side and they're spying out the army, come, let us cross over the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps Yahweh will work for us, for Yahweh is not restrained to save by few, or by many, or by few. Right? So now you get into the mind of Jonathan, and he's kind of acting impulsive. He's kind of made this decision to go over there. But his mindset is, God can do whatever he wants. God is not restrained by many or few, right? He's looking and saying, God can handle this situation. We're just two guys against a bunch, right? We're watching this army, and God can do whatever he wants. And so a different mindset than trying to force God's hand and offering the sacrifice. Here, they're praying about it. You get this thoughtfulness of God's power in the right direction. So the armor bearer says to him in verse 7, do all that is in your heart. Turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your heart. So Jonathan thinks about it, and in verse 8 it says, behold, we will cross over the Jordan to meet this army, right? We're going to meet the men and reveal ourselves to them, right? If they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand in our place and not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for Yahweh has given them into our hands, and this shall be the sign to us. So he sets up this simplicity test in a sense. It's like, well, if they come chasing us, we know to run. Okay? But if they're so overconfident, they say, sure, come on down to us. We know God's given them into our hand. Right? Now, they have this army that's sitting there, and they've been watching this Philistine garrison, which is a sizable part of their army. They're going to walk out with two guys in the middle of this field and go, hey, how's it going? Right? Sounds like a brilliant plan. But if they come down to chase us, we know to run, turn tail, and run. If they say, two guys, yeah, come on down, then we're good. We know God's given them into our hand. I don't advise setting up those kind of tests, but this is what Jonathan does. But it's an indication of his heart and his mind and his thinking that he's looking to see what God might do in this situation. And so that's what happens, right? They come down and they wait. They reveal themselves in verse 11. The Philistines said, behold, Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves. So they said in verse 12, come up to us, and we're going to teach you a lesson. Right? And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, come up after me, for Yahweh has given them into the hands of Israel. So they do that. They come up in verse 13, and then they climbed up on his hands and feet with his armor bearer behind him, and they fell before Jonathan and his armor bearer and put some to death after him. They begin to slaughter, and that's what it says in verse 14, right? At that first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men with about half a furrow and an acre of land. So they're trying to say that as they're basically just marching their way into this garrison and hacking them down left and right, killing 20 men, in a short amount of distance. So 2 men go up and 20 men fall in the first round of battle. At that point in verse 15 it says there was trembling in the camp and in the field and all among the people. Even the garrison and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it became a great trembling. So now God's kind of backing them up and saying, you don't know what you're dealing with here, right? The ground's going to shake, and you guys, it just creates a great fear in the men who are on the side with where Jonathan is at. 16 says, Saul's watchmen in Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and behold, the multitude melted away, and they went here and there. So Saul's standing back, and he's watching the army, and he's going, I don't know what to do yet. Jonathan's in there mixing it up, and he strikes down 20 men, and he doesn't even know where he's at. All of a sudden, the ground shakes, and everybody starts running away, and Saul says, I don't know what's going on, right? What's going on? And he's just watching this thing happen, and he has no idea why they're running, what's going on, what Jonathan is doing. Verse 17, Saul said to the people who were with him, number now and see who has gone from us. And when they had numbered, behold, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. And Saul said to Ahijah, bring the ark of God here, for the ark of God was at that time with the sons of Israel. And it happened that while Saul talked to the priest, the commotion in the camp of the Philistines continued to increase. So they're taking their time and they're saying, hurry up and bring the ark up here. Something's happening. So they're waiting for the ark to go up. there's just confusion reigning everywhere, right? Saul still has no idea. We figured out Jonathan's gone, calling the Ark of the Covenant up. Everybody's running around like crazy people. They don't know what's going on. And that's what's kind of happening in verse, he's bringing in. And it says in verse 19, it happened that when Saul talked to the priest, the commotion in the camp continued and increased. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle. So he's like, we're not waiting anymore, right? This confusion just keeps increasing. Let's go. And they go into battle. And it says in verse 20, all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle, and behold, every man's sword was against his fellow, and there was very great confusion. So now Saul's men are running into the battle, and the Philistines just start hacking themselves to pieces. They're just so confused, and God has confused them to the point where they're just... Remember, the Israelites don't have swords. So every man had a sword, just started hacking their fellow man to pieces. That's the Philistines. Now they're just killing themselves. So, in verse 21, the Hebrews who were with him, with the Philistines previously, who went up with them all around the camp, even they also turned to be with the Israelites who were with Saul. Now the ones who ran away see what's going on. They're like, we're going to go back and fight. So now there's more than 600 men. Others are starting to join in. They're turning around from running and say, well, looks like we're winning. I think we'll join in on this one. So they turn around and they join in with Saul and Jonathan. Now all the men of Israel who had hidden themselves in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines fled. They come out, and they begin to pursue them closely in the battle. So Yahweh saved Israel that day, and the battle spread. Right? You have this horrible plan to go into battle, and God can pull it out of the fire, right? You're going to go in with 600 men with pitchforks and axes. God uses Jonathan to cause confusion, because Jonathan trusted in Yahweh. Saul, in the meantime, is looking at the confusion, doesn't know what to do until he can't stand it anymore, and he has to go into battle. Right? He's waiting for the ark to come up. The ark never makes it, and he says, it's too late. They're just in so much confusion. Let's go. And he jumps into the battle. So Saul still is not thinking like a strategist. He's not thinking about what God is doing. He's just kind of reacting to the situation.
So is he kind of like using the ark as this magic?
I think he still has an element of that, yeah.
That's what's going to win the battle.
Yeah.
That God can do it without the ark, and he doesn't.
Yeah, I think he's waiting for it as a confirmation that God's with him. Because, he already screwed up with the sacrifice. I think he's kind of going, let's make sure we got the magic box, just in case. Yep, I do. And in the midst of that, God creates so much confusion that it's just not showing up on time, and he jumps into the battle again without it, right? So he's looking for options. That's the way I look at this. It's this self-powered searching for an answer, right? Where Jonathan kind of says ahead of time, hey, this is how I'm going to know. God can do whatever he wants, and here's my test. God will give me an answer. Now I'm not looking back. I'm just going all in, right? Once God gives an answer, I know what to do, and I'm all in on this. Saul's going, option A didn't work out very good. Let's look for option B. Option B doesn't look like it's showing up late. The box isn't showing up. Their confusion is really strange. I don't understand it, but let's go and fight. I don't think he has all the info. I don't think he's asking God. I don't think he knows what's going on with Jonathan still. He just knows he's not there, and he doesn't know what else to do. I think he just doesn't know what else to do, so he jumps into battle.
Without swords.
Pretty much, yeah. Well, he's got a sword. What did he care? Yeah. His men do not have a sword. They have axes and pitchforks and what other farming tools they mentioned.
This is where you pick up the sword from the dead guy.
I would. And if it was me, I'd be picking up the first dead guy I saw. I'd be picking up that sword. But yeah, so you kind of get into that mode of understanding the confusion that takes place, right? And the confusion is just leading to this whole battle that happens where God delivers, but Saul doesn't even know how he's doing it. Saul doesn't even know what happened yet. He has no idea that Jonathan is fighting. and that he's killed 20 men, and that he's on the other side, of the army fighting and duking it out with them. He knows he's not there. He doesn't know why God confused the army. He didn't know it was going to happen. And he's just reacting to the situation. And that's just kind of how I read that, right? So part of his failure is not seeking God's will, praying and trusting, obeying, right? You don't have those elements included in Saul's thinking, where you do, even though he's young and rash. And as a parent, you're going, I wish he wouldn't have jumped over there and did that. But he did it. But God's with him because he has a right mindset. That's because he makes a rash choice. He's still trusting God in the whole situation, right? So, you have a lot of things to think about when you're thinking about Saul and Jonathan, and about how they make decisions and about how they operate, in their worldview, right? And we know that ultimately Saul has no heart for God, but you do see a heart for God in Jonathan, and you see that the theology at work of trusting God in this situation, versus just looking for whatever option is out there, right? And I think that's a big part of what sets up the reign of Saul, and you get through these other battles that are going to happen, and you'll see more of that. But that's just kind of how, when I read through this battle and you're trying to look for the way that they're thinking, right? To me, a lot of it is about understanding what's in their mindset, and you get a lot of, I call it anxiety and fear in Saul that makes him react the way he does, not trusting God, disobeying God, where you have a little bit different picture in Jonathan, where he might make a rash choice, but his decision making is trusting in God, looking for what God is doing in the situation. Any questions up to that point? We're moving slow, but I think there's a lot of good to get out of this. So no problem there. I want to break at that point. We'll pick up, look at the oath and more foolishness when we get back next week. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for allowing us to have the insight that you give us in inspired Scripture. And hopefully and prayerfully we can see a lot of the difficulties and challenges of decision making and trusting in the pages of Scripture, helping us to know, Lord, and learn the lessons of trusting you with our whole heart and walking accordingly. And Lord, I just pray that in the coming weeks, as we see that the reign of Saul and the transition time of Saul to David, that you allow us to learn much in regard to just understanding good counsel and wisdom, walking with you. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.